I was seated at the end of the dining table, my hands folded loosely over one another when she said it. 30 days, my stepdaughter announced. That's more than fair. Her voice carried easily through the room, confident, settled, the way people sound when they believe something already belongs to them. The attorney paused mid-note, pen hovering just above the paper. Two relatives who had stayed after the service looked up from their coffee cups. No one spoke. Everyone heard her. She didn't look at me when she continued. She addressed the room instead, as if I were a logistical detail already resolved. This is my father's house, she said. It's time to be practical. I stayed where I was. The chair didn't move. The table between us remained untouched. I noticed a faint ring at the bottom of my glass where condensation had settled and dried. The attorney cleared his throat. Just to be clear, he said carefully, this is a discussion, not an order. She doesn't need the house, my stepdaughter cut in. She has her own life. I'm not throwing her out. I'm setting a timeline. She finally looked at me then. Her expression wasn't angry. It was assured. Like someone closing a door they believed had always been theirs to close. I'm sure you understand, she said. This isn't personal. I didn't respond. Silence stretched longer than she expected. The kind that makes people shift in their seats, suddenly aware of how loudly they're breathing. She filled it. My father wanted me to have stability, she said. He wanted things handled cleanly. The attorney glanced at me, waiting. I met his eyes briefly and gave a small, neutral nod. He looked back down at his notes. No one defended me. No one needed to. The moment wasn't about fairness. It was about display. She straightened, satisfied, and gathered her bag as if the matter were settled. 30 days, she repeated, softer this time. That should be enough. The room went quiet again after she stopped speaking. I remained seated, my hands still folded, listening to the sound of nothing filling the space she had just vacated. My name is Evelyn Mercer. I was 51 years old when that conversation took place, and I had been living in that house for just over 11 years. I worked as an operations manager for a regional healthcare group, nothing public-facing, nothing glamorous. The kind of role that rewards precision, follow-through, and an ability to keep calm when other people can't. My life was based in Northern California. My name was on my own lease downtown. I had my own accounts, my own routine, my own credit history. I wasn't dependent on that house for shelter, income, or identity. What I was, at that moment, was legally present. The dining room where we sat wasn't staged for drama. It was orderly. Papers stacked neatly at one end of the table. The attorney's briefcase rested against the leg of his chair, closed. Everything about the setting suggested process, not conflict. I had married my husband in my late 30s. By the time I entered his life, his daughter was already an adult. There were no custody arrangements, no parental authority to negotiate. We existed in parallel, connected by him, respectful but distant. In the months leading up to his death, I had handled the practicalities, appointments, insurance calls, end-of-life documentation, not because anyone asked me to, but because someone had to. That afternoon, none of that needed to be explained. The attorney knew who I was. He had worked with me before. He addressed his emails to me directly. He confirmed details with me, not around me. When my stepdaughter spoke about timelines and ownership, she wasn't correcting an imbalance. She was assuming one. My husband had been ill for 22 months, not continuously hospitalized, not dramatic, just steadily diminished in ways that required attention to detail: medication schedules, insurance approvals, transportation, documentation that needed signatures before deadlines quietly expired. I took responsibility for those things because I was there, and because I was capable of doing so. That division of labor was never debated. It settled naturally, the way practical arrangements often do. His daughter visited when she could, holidays, occasional weekends. She asked questions when she needed information and trusted that the answers would be handled. There was no conflict about roles. There was an understanding, even if it was never spoken aloud. During those months, my husband and I discussed logistics the same way we discussed everything else plainly. What needed to be organized? What should be protected? What shouldn't become complicated later? Fairness mattered to him. Order mattered. He was clear about that. After his death, the imbalance didn't appear suddenly. It simply became visible. The eviction wasn't framed as punishment. It was framed as efficiency, a decision made quickly, publicly, and without consultation, not because it was necessary, but because she believed it was hers to make. That belief had existed long before the funeral. I had noticed it in smaller ways over the years, in assumptions about priority, in conversations that skipped over me, in decisions discussed as conclusions rather than questions. It was never hostile, just directional. I didn't correct it. There was no benefit in doing so. What mattered was not how she felt about me. It was how the situation was structured and whether the agreements that already existed would be honored. The moment at the table wasn't painful. It was clarifying. She wasn't grieving when she spoke. She was organizing. And she assumed I was something that could be moved. There had never been confusion about who handled what. When my husband and I married, we kept our finances structured and explicit. Separate accounts where they made sense. Shared accounts where responsibility overlapped. Everything documented. Everything reviewed annually. Usually at the same time we renewed insurance policies and updated beneficiary forms. He preferred it that way. So did I. As his health declined, those structures mattered more. Bills didn't stop arriving because someone was sick. Deadlines didn't soften. Systems either worked or they didn't. I coordinated with his doctors directly. I tracked coverage changes when his employer-sponsored plan ended and private insurance took over. I handled the paperwork that followed every hospitalization, the quiet accumulation of forms that determine whether something is reimbursed or quietly denied. His daughter was aware of all of this. She had access when she asked for it. She never objected to how things were managed. She didn't need to. The outcomes spoke for themselves. There was a rhythm to those months. Predictable, controlled. When decisions needed to be made, we made them. When something required patience, we waited. My husband trusted me with details because I treated them seriously. Not sentimentally, not defensively, just correctly. That trust wasn't theatrical. It didn't come with speeches or last-minute declarations. It showed up in signatures, in designations, in how documents were filed and stored, and who was copied on which correspondence. I didn't involve his daughter in every administrative step. There was no reason to. She lived in another state. She had her own career, her own household. Information was available to her, but responsibility stayed with me. That wasn't avoidance. It was efficiency. Over time, it became clear that silence was useful, not as submission, but as positioning. Letting assumptions sit untouched allows structures to do their work without interference. When his health stabilized briefly in the final year, we revisited our arrangements one last time. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was emotional. We reviewed what already existed and confirmed it still made sense. It did. After he passed, I didn't change anything. I didn't need to. Every relevant decision had already been made by someone who understood the implications, respected process, and expected those processes to be followed. By the time my stepdaughter spoke about timelines and ownership at that table, she wasn't encountering something new. She was colliding with something that had been in place for years. The trust had been established 6 years earlier, not quietly and not in response to any conflict. It was created after my husband sold a minority interest in his company and wanted a structure that would handle distribution cleanly if something happened to him. Taxes, timing, protection, the usual concerns of someone who preferred order over improvisation. I was named the controlling trustee. That decision wasn't symbolic. It came with defined authority and specific obligations. The trust owned the house outright. It held several long-term investments and a cash reserve intended for maintenance, taxes, and administrative costs. My role was to manage it according to the terms already written, not to interpret intent after the fact. His daughter was listed as a beneficiary, not excluded, not punished, simply conditional. Her access was staged, partial distributions at set age milestones, larger releases contingent on stability benchmarks and trustee approval. The language was clear, conservative even, designed to prevent exactly the kind of rushed decisions that tend to follow loss. None of this was secret. The documents were drafted by professionals, reviewed more than once, signed, notarized, and filed. Copies existed in physical form and digitally. The attorney who sat at the table that afternoon had overseen its creation. I didn't add clauses. I didn't amend terms. I didn't need to. What mattered was that the trust operated independently of emotion. It didn't respond to grief, anger, or urgency. It responded to process. The house my stepdaughter referred to as her father's was not part of the probate estate. It hadn't been for years. Ownership had already transferred. Maintenance and taxes were paid by the trust on a fixed schedule without interruption. My authority as trustee couldn't be overridden by volume or assertion, only by formal removal, which required cause, documentation, and court approval. Apologies didn't qualify, neither did outrage. This wasn't leverage I activated. It was a system that had been quietly functioning long before anyone raised their voice. I had never needed to mention it, because there had never been a reason to. Structures like that are most effective when they're allowed to remain unnoticed. At the table, while my stepdaughter spoke about timelines, I thought briefly about the binder in my office. The one labeled with dates, not names, tabs neatly aligned, pages unmarked. Nothing in it was reactive. It existed because responsibility had been anticipated, not because conflict had occurred. And it would operate the same way regardless of who believed they were in control. The meeting was scheduled for the following week, not at the house, at the attorney's office downtown, where conversations like this were meant to take place. Neutral walls, conference table, diplomas framed in simple black. Nothing sentimental, nothing personal. My stepdaughter arrived first. She was already standing when I entered, phone in hand, agitation visible but contained. Confidence had shifted into irritation, the kind that assumes delay is an inconvenience, not a warning. I took my seat without acknowledging it. The attorney joined us moments later, accompanied by a paralegal carrying a thin stack of documents. No one rushed. No one apologized for the wait. "Thank you for coming," he said evenly. "We'll proceed." He began by confirming names for the record, dates, jurisdiction, routine formalities that slowed the room down whether anyone liked it or not. Then he opened the file. "The residence," he said, "is held in trust." My stepdaughter frowned. "That can't be right. My father owned the house." "He did," the attorney replied. "Until 6 years ago." He turned a page. The sound of paper against paper was sharp in the quiet. "At that time, ownership transferred to the Mercer Family Trust. The trust is irrevocable." She leaned forward. "I was never told that. The documents were executed properly," he said. "Notification is not a requirement for validity." She looked at me then, searching for something: confirmation, contradiction, reaction. "I didn't offer one," the attorney continued. "The trust names Miss Mercer as controlling trustee. What does that mean?" She asked too quickly. "It means," he said, "that she has fiduciary authority over trust assets, including the residence." "That's not permanent," she said. "Trustees can be removed." "Yes," he agreed. "With cause." He paused. "Let the word settle." "Cause," he repeated, "requires breach of duty, mismanagement, impropriety, none of which are present." Her voice rose. "So she controls everything?" "Within the terms of the trust," he said. "Yes." She shook her head, disbelief giving way to something sharper. "I'm his daughter, and a beneficiary," he replied. "With conditional access." He turned another page. Distributions are scheduled, he said, reading aloud. Initial partial release at age 35. Additional releases contingent on financial stability metrics and trustee approval. That's ridiculous, she said. I need access now. The trust does not respond to need, he said calmly. It responds to criteria. She stood. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. You can't keep me out of my own house, she said, her voice tight now. You don't belong there. The attorney looked at her steadily. The trust owns the house. Occupancy decisions fall under trustee authority. She turned back to me, breath shallow. Say something. I waited a moment before responding. You should let him finish, I said. It was the first time I had spoken since we sat down. The paralegal slid a document across the table. A summary, clean, typed, no annotations. Eviction authority, the attorney said, tapping the page lightly, rests with the trust, not the beneficiaries. Her hands trembled as she read. Anger gave way to calculation, then to panic. This isn't over, she said. I'll fight this. You're entitled to legal review, he replied. The terms will remain in effect during any challenge. She sank back into her chair, deflated but still resisting. The attorney closed the folder. Do you have any further questions, he asked, regarding the trust's operation? She didn't answer. Silence filled the room again. This time, it stayed. The outcome had already been confirmed. Everything else was noise. The first challenge was filed within a month. It was procedural, predictable, a request for trustee review, followed by a formal petition questioning authority. The trust's response was submitted on schedule, supported by documentation that had already been reviewed and accepted years earlier. The petition was dismissed without a hearing. By the end of the summer, a second attempt followed. Different language, same outcome. The trust remained intact, the terms unchanged. Time continued to move. Without immediate access to funds, adjustments became necessary. Short-term arrangements replaced assumptions. Credit lines tightened. A lease that had been discussed informally was never signed. Plans that depended on early distribution were quietly abandoned. By the end of the year, the house was no longer referenced as hers. Maintenance continued as scheduled. Taxes were paid. Insurance renewed. Occupancy decisions were handled through the trust's administrator, not through family channels. Everything proceeded without interruption. There were conversations I didn't hear. I know this because people stopped mentioning her name around me. Invitations changed tone. Group messages shortened. The kind of social contraction that doesn't announce itself, but becomes visible through absence. A professional notice arrived in the mail that winter. Standard language. Trustee authority reaffirmed. No commentary. No emotion. Months passed. The trust released nothing early. There were no exceptions. Compliance was tracked. Benchmarks remained unmet. By the following spring, she had stopped contesting the structure altogether. There were no more filings. No more letters. Just silence. I wasn't present for any of it. That distance was intentional. The system didn't require supervision. It had been designed to operate without personal involvement, and it did. Consequences didn't arrive all at once. They accumulated slowly, the way outcomes tend to when they're governed by process instead of reaction. Nothing dramatic happened. Access narrowed. Options reduced. Control shifted away from assumption and back towards structure. By the time the year turned over again, the situation had settled into something stable and unremarkable, which was exactly how it had been designed to end. Order has a way of revealing itself once emotion steps out of the way. What happened afterward was not about punishment or reward. It was about boundaries being enforced exactly as they had been defined, without interpretation or exception. The trust continued to function as intended. Assets were preserved. Obligations were met. Nothing required commentary. Grief does not entitle anyone to rewrite agreements. That was the clarity my husband valued, and it was the standard he left behind. Not as a lesson, but as a structure, one that respected responsibility over assumption. I remained in the house for a measured period, long enough to complete the trust's transition plan and prepare it for long-term management. When I left, it was deliberate, documented, clean. The trust continues to fund what it was designed to support: maintenance, education allocations, a modest annual contribution to a local hospice program, arranged quietly and without acknowledgement. I don't receive updates unless they're required. I don't ask questions that don't serve a